I stood backstage, listening to my own introduction play over the speakers, and somewhere in the third row of that auditorium sat the family that walked out of my life 7 years ago for the price of $200 and a bus ticket. They didn't know I was the keynote speaker. They had bought tickets to a charity gala because my mother's church group had been invited as guests of the sponsoring organization. They had no idea, sitting there in their good clothes, smiling at each other, that the woman about to walk onto that stage was the daughter they'd told to leave and never come back. I had 43 voicemails saved on my phone, 43 messages left over the past 2 years, after they discovered, through a simple Google search of my name, that I had become the chief operating officer of a consulting firm in Portland. 43 voicemails asking for money, asking for help, asking me to remember where I came from. Not one of those 43 voicemails contained an apology. My name is Selena Lawson. I am 30 years old. For most of my childhood, I was the scapegoat in a family that needed someone to blame for everything that went wrong. I walked out at 23 with $200 in my pocket and nowhere to go. Tonight, I was about to walk onto a stage in front of 300 people, including the family that abandoned me, and tell the truth for the first time in my life. There is a specific role that exists in some families, and if you've lived it, you already know exactly what I mean before I even explain it. The scapegoat is the person everything gets blamed on. Not because they did anything wrong necessarily, but because every family system that runs on dysfunction needs somewhere to put the blame, so the actual dysfunction never has to be looked at directly. In my family, that role was mine from the time I was about 9 years old. If my father lost his temper, it was because I had provoked him. If my brother got in trouble at school, it was because I hadn't set a good enough example. If money was tight, it was somehow connected to something I had asked for, even when what I'd asked for was nothing more than school supplies. I left home the day after I turned 23, not dramatically, quietly. I had been saving small amounts of cash from a part-time retail job for almost a year, hidden in a shoe I kept in the back of my closet, because I had learned by then that anything kept in plain sight in that house eventually disappeared or became a source of conflict. I left with $200, one suitcase, and a bus ticket to a city 600 miles away, where I knew exactly no one. I built everything that came after from that $200. The first 2 years in Portland were the hardest of my entire life, and I say that fully aware of how difficult some of the years before it had already been. I worked 2 part-time jobs while completing certifications in business administration through community college night classes. I slept on a friend of a friend's couch for the first 4 months, then in a studio apartment so small that my bed touched 3 walls at once. I did not call home. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't because I had stopped caring whether my family was okay. It was because every single time I reached out in those early years, birthdays, holidays, the year I got my first full-time office job, the response was either silence or, worse, a brief reply that somehow circled back to what I owed them, what I took from them simply by leaving, what burden I had created by no longer being there to absorb whatever needed absorbing. So I stopped reaching out, and they never once reached out to me, not for 7 years. I built a career slowly and deliberately. I started as an administrative assistant at a small consulting firm. I learned everything I could about the business side of the operation, took on more responsibility than my title technically required, and by the time I was 28, I had been promoted twice and was managing a team of 12. At 29, I was named Chief Operating Officer. The company did a press release. It wasn't a major national story, but it was picked up by a regional business journal, and it included my photo and my name, in full. That press release is, as far as I can tell, exactly how my family found me again. The first voicemail came 3 days after the article published. It was from my mother. Her tone was warm, almost cheerful, as if 7 years of silence simply hadn't happened. She said she'd seen the article, that she was proud of me, that she hoped we could catch up soon. I didn't call back immediately. I sat with that voicemail for a month before I responded, briefly, politely, non-committal. The second voicemail came 2 weeks later. This one was different in tone. She mentioned that my younger brother was having some financial trouble and wondered if I might be able to help just this once, given everything you have now. I did not respond to that one. The voicemails continued. Over the following 2 years, the count grew to 43. Some were from my mother. Some were from my father, who had never once in 23 years of my life under his roof called me simply to ask how I was doing, and somehow found the motivation to call now that there was money to discuss. A few were from my brother directly, each one slightly more desperate than the last. I saved every single one, not because I intended to use them, at least not at first. I saved them because some instinct in me understood that I needed a record of exactly what this relationship had become, in case I ever needed to prove to myself on a difficult day that I wasn't imagining the pattern. About a year into the voicemails, I discovered something else. Going through old family records to settle a minor tax matter connected to my late grandmother's modest estate, I found documentation showing that a small education fund my grandmother had set up, intended specifically for my college expenses, established when I was 12, had been accessed and depleted by my mother years before I ever turned 18. My signature appeared on a withdrawal authorization form when I was 16. I never signed that form. I never even knew the fund existed until I found the paperwork. It was forged. I sat with that discovery for a long time before I decided what to do with it. I want to explain something about how I process difficult information, because I think it matters for understanding everything that happened after. I do not react quickly. I have learned through years of building a career in a field that rewards careful, deliberate thinking that the strongest response to betrayal is rarely the fastest one. I had a forged signature on an official withdrawal form. I had 43 voicemails asking for money with 0 apologies attached. I had 7 years of silence that had only broken the moment my name appeared in a press release with $signs implied. I consulted a forensic document specialist, a woman my company occasionally worked with for in-related business matters, and asked her informally whether she could examine the signature for authenticity. She compared it against verified samples of my actual signature from around that same age, taken from old-school records I still had access to. Her assessment was clear. The signature on the withdrawal form did not match my established signature pattern in several specific technical ways. It was, in her professional opinion, a forgery. I did not pursue legal action against my mother for this. I want to be honest about that, because I think people sometimes expect every story like this to end in a courtroom, and that isn't always the most meaningful form of justice available. What I decided to pursue instead was something different. About 6 months after this discovery, I was contacted by a regional nonprofit organization that supports young professionals from difficult family backgrounds. They were hosting a charity gala and asked me if I would be willing to deliver the keynote address, sharing my professional journey as an example for the young people the organization served. I said yes immediately. What I did not know until the week of the event was that the gala's guest list included several local community and church groups who had purchased tables as sponsors, including, as it turned out, a congregation my mother had recently joined. I found out 3 days before the event that my family would be in the audience. I almost backed out. I sat with that decision for an entire evening, turning it over in every direction I could think of. Then I decided, no. If anything, this was exactly the room I needed to speak in. I did not rewrite my entire speech in the days leading up to the event. The core of what I planned to say, about resilience, about building a life from almost nothing, about the importance of believing in your own worth, even when no one around you reflects it back to you, remained essentially the same. What I did add was honesty, specific, careful, documented honesty. I called the nonprofit's event coordinator and explained the situation in broad terms, without going into every detail. I told her that members of my biological family would be in attendance, that our relationship was complicated, and that I intended to speak honestly about my background as part of my story, in a way that might be more pointed than she expected. She told me the choice was entirely mine, and that the organization trusted me to handle it with the same judgment I'd clearly used to build everything else in my life. I spent the days before the event organizing my thoughts the way I organize a difficult business decision, clearly, with structure, without unnecessary embellishment. I did not plan to read the voicemails aloud verbatim or display the forged signature on a screen behind me. That was never the point. The point was to tell my actual story honestly, in a room that included people who had spent years trying to control a different version of it. I printed a single page of notes, not a script, just a structure to keep me anchored, and I practiced the speech twice with a colleague I trusted, someone who knew enough of my background to give me honest feedback about tone. She told me, "Don't make it about them, make it about you. Let the truth do whatever it's going to do to them on its own." That became my guiding principle for the entire speech. I walked onto that stage and saw them almost immediately. Third row, slightly left of center. My mother in a pale blue dress, my father beside her, looking, as he had always done, slightly impatient even while sitting still. My brother 2 seats down, scrolling on his phone until the applause for my introduction made him look up. I began the way I had planned, with my actual story, growing up as the family scapegoat, leaving at 23 with $200, the years of building something from nothing alone, without a single phone call from the family I'd left behind. I watched my mother's expression shift slightly as I described those early years. I don't think she expected me to be this specific in a public setting. Then I reached the part of the speech I had decided, carefully, deliberately, to include. I said, 2 years ago, after a small press release about a promotion, I started receiving phone calls from the same family that gone 7 years without checking on me even once. I want to tell you something important about those calls. I saved every one, 43 voicemails, over 2 years. Every single one asked me for something. Not one of them said the word sorry. I did not look directly at them as I said this. I looked at the broader audience, at the young professionals the nonprofit served, because they were the actual reason I was standing there. I continued, I also discovered during that same period that a small education fund set up for me as a child had been accessed using a signature that wasn't mine. I want to be clear about why I'm sharing this tonight. It isn't to humiliate anyone in this room. It's because so many young people who have gone through something similar spend years wondering if they're remembering things correctly, if they're being too harsh, if maybe they're the problem after all. I am here to tell you, you are allowed to trust what you experienced. You are allowed to build a life that doesn't require the approval of people who only valued you once you had something they wanted. The room was completely silent for a moment. Then, slowly, the applause started, first from the back, then spreading forward until it filled the entire auditorium. I did not look at my family's row again. I didn't need to. I had said what I came to say, and it wasn't, in the end, about them at all. The speech was filmed by the nonprofit for their own promotional purposes, and within a week had been shared widely enough that it reached well beyond the original audience in that auditorium. My mother left 2 voicemails after the event. I listened to both. Neither contained an apology. Both expressed embarrassment about being put on the spot in front of people from her church community. I did not respond to either. What happened next, I learned mostly secondhand, through a cousin who still occasionally checked in with me. My mother stepped down from a leadership position within her church's community outreach committee about 2 months after the event, following what my cousin described as some uncomfortable conversations within the congregation. My brother's small landscaping business, which had been struggling for over a year, formally closed about 4 months later. I did not orchestrate any of this. I want to be completely clear about that. I told the truth in a room I was invited to speak in for reasons that had nothing to do with my family, and the consequences that followed were simply the natural result of a community learning something true about people they had previously only seen one curated version of. 6 months after the gala, using a portion of my own savings, I established a small scholarship fund through the same nonprofit that had invited me to speak, specifically for young people who had become estranged from their families before completing their education, to help cover costs that a family member's support might otherwise have provided. I named it without my own name attached. I didn't want it to be about me. I wanted it to be about what I'd needed most during those first 2 impossible years in Portland. A little bit of help from someone who simply believed I deserved a chance without strings, without an invoice attached later. I still have all 43 voicemails saved. I don't listen to them anymore. I kept them for a long time as proof. I think now I keep them mostly as a reminder of how far I've come from needing anyone's approval to know exactly who I am. If Selena's story reminded you that the family you build through your own resilience can matter more than the family you were given, and that you are allowed to walk away from people who only show up when they need something, hit the like button for every scapegoat who finally got to tell the truth out loud. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Honest. Have you ever been the one your family blamed for things that weren't your fault? Type yes in the comments if you've ever carried weight that was never actually yours to carry. I want you to know you're not the only one tonight. And wherever you're listening from right now, drop your city and the local time. I love knowing exactly how far this story is reaching. If this is for someone you know, someone quietly building a life away from people who never deserved their loyalty in the first place, share it with them. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply stop waiting for an apology that was never going to come and build something better instead. I'll see you in the next story. The lounge is always open.